Thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Gombrich, for inviting me. Thank you also to Professor Jan Westerhoff for suggesting this in the first place. Yes, I was actually trying to find a catchy title, but what I'm going to talk is a relatively technical subject matter. So I hope you will find it easy to follow. I am going to offer some slides, but I will not just read what is on the slide. I will try to elaborate on them, and I hope that between what you will see and what I will say, this subject matter will become more understandable. So this is our verse, the main topic, the starting point, and also the end point of this talk. So I wish to read it once. Kriya na pratyavati, na pratyavati kriya. Pratyaya na kriyavantah, kriyavantas chasantyuta. So this is Mula Madhyamaka Karika 1-4, according to most numberings. Of course, there are some differences, but so it's part of the first chapter. And this is a translation that I offer. There is no activity endowed with conditions. There is no activity not endowed with conditions. There are no conditions not endowed with an activity or endowed with an activity. So, now going into the background of this verse, let's start by discussing the overall background of Madhyamaka philosophy. And here I include a background which I think is common to most Indian philosophy, which is the context of Vyakarana and Nirukti. These are two terms that relate to certain intellectual concerns which we could call grammar and etymology, very broadly understood. Certain specific areas of these two shastras have more of an impact on Indian philosophy and especially on Buddhist philosophy, and this is what I hope I can show during this talk. Then, of course, Madhyamaka has a Buddhist, specifically Buddhist background, which I think includes non-Mahayana sutras, and the Abhidharma. But by Abhidharma, I here mean something very specific, which I shall specify. Non-Mahayana sutras, well, it is not very easy to know what would be the background of the Mula Madhyamaka Karika and of Nagarjuna's writing. I found that there is a section of the Nidana Samyukta which seems to be related to the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, and of course this has its parallels in Pali, although there are some differences as well. For example, the Katyayana Vavada in Sanskrit has some significant differences compared to the Kachanagotta Sutta in Pali. The wording is a little bit different. And so generally I prefer to look for the possible Sanskrit versions of the sutras, non-Mahayana sutras, which might have been the background for Nagarjuna. Then we have Mahayana sutras as an overall background of Madhyamaka. This becomes rather obvious because they are quoted very often by the commentators. So if we read the commentators on the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, we find that certain sutras are especially prominent. One such sutra, which I think is worth mentioning, is the Shalistamba Sutra. The Shalistamba Sutra is, in my opinion, a very important and interesting Mahayana Sutra because it partly overlaps with what we find in non-Mahayana Sutras, and at the same time I believe it has some unique features which would distinguish it from its non-Mahayana counterparts. And then Abhidharma. But I use the term Abhidharma in a somewhat broad sense because what constitutes Abhidharma in a Buddhist context is a complex question, because we have different Buddhist groups having a different relation to what could be called the Abhidharma Pitaka. For example, for our purposes, it's important to distinguish between the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika position. If we take the Vaibhashika, they would say that indeed the Shastras of the Abhidharma were taught by the Buddha himself. Perhaps not in the present form, but still they were taught by the Buddha. On the other hand, the Sautrantikas would say that yes, the Buddha did teach the Abhidharma, but not in those Shastras. He taught the Abhidharma in certain sutras, and as an example they give a sutra called the Artha-Vinishchaya Sutra, which in fact, the title itself is glossed by the author of its available Sanskrit commentary in a way as to make it a synonym of the word Abhidharma. This is an interesting feature of that commentary. The Artha Vinishchaya is glossed as a synonym of Dharma Pravichaya. And Dharma Pravichaya, the classification or proper grouping of the dharmas, is itself one of the main synonyms of the word Abhidharma. Madhyamaka itself can be considered to be Abhidharma. According to some Madhyamaka authors, the Abhidharma which we find in, let's say, the Vaibhashika fold, or according to the Sautrantika in certain sutras, is conventional Abhidharma. On the other hand, Madhyamaka represents the Paramarthika Abhidharma, the Abhidharma in the ultimate sense. And this makes sense because, again, Madhyamaka has an emphasis on prajna, a kind of higher cognition, which itself is another synonym of Abhidharma. So we can see that the word Abhidharma has a very complex relationship with the background of Madhyamaka philosophy. And here I have singled out the idea of dependent arising, because this is going to be particularly important in case of interpreting the verse that I have just presented, and also for my overall argument about the importance of Sanskrit grammar, since my argument passes through dependent arising. So, I now start by a definition of karaka. And I'm introducing a technical concept, so I should explain a little bit. In my opinion, the idea of karaka is crucial to understand traditional Sanskrit grammar. I think it appears in almost all levels of analysis. So, I've called a karaka a syntactical factor, but this is really a kind of loose definition, because karaka relationship, more specifically, are the relationship between an action and a factor which helps the accomplishment of that action. And this type of relationship in Sanskrit can be expressed in a variety of ways. We are used to think of expressing that type of relationship by distributing it between, let's say, a subject, a verb, an object, and some complements. But that is not necessarily the case in Sanskrit. Karaka relationships also operate within a single term, and this is thanks to the very perceptible etymological link that Sanskrit words have to their dhatus, which are their etymological roots. So, but broadly speaking, I think you can already perceive that there is a link between this type of approach towards linguistic analysis and the idea of causality, the idea of something arising due to causal factors. In fact, one of the very old definitions of akaraka is this, which we find in the Mahabhashya, karoti iti karakamiti. It does something, thus it is a factor. And it does something means that it helps in one way or another to accomplish an action. Here is a more direct example. This is not my own invention. This is a recurrent example. Devadattaha agnina odanam pachati. Let's say Devadatta is cooking or cooks rice by means of fire. So here we have three karakas according to Panini's analysis. We have an action, the action of cooking. We have an agent of that action, which is Devadatta. We have an instrument. And then we have an object of the action, which is called karma. This itself is significant. And as you can see, we can think of these as causal factors. The agent, the instrument, the object are all necessary for the final result of getting from uncooked rice to softened rice. The idea that karakas can or should be understood as causal factors is not my own. It is indeed what many grammatical commentators highlight. And they also mention one very interesting feature of these karakas, which is none of them is completely autonomous. In other words, in order to obtain the accomplishment of an action, we cannot have a completely autonomous karaka. This is a point which is made by grammatical commentators and which I found particularly interesting because it is well understood by Buddhist authors, even in the context of discussing the agency, the possible agency of a self. So I'm anticipating something that I will say later. But this principle is important. No cause or no karaka is perfectly independent or literally autonomous. So even within a grammatical context, the important Buddhist idea of a causal assemblage is hinted at. These are some of the important grammarians that I will be referring to and that are the basis for this study. Patanjali, Vamanan Jayaditya, Jinendra Buddhi, Purushottama Deva. Let me briefly say that out of these, at least 3 are Buddhist, perhaps 4. We are not certain about one of the 2. The Vamana and Jayaditya co-authored a text, and their specific religious affiliation is a little bit uncertain. However, Jinendra Buddhi was quite certainly a Buddhist, and he has been identified also with the commentator on Dignaga, so he also wrote on Buddhist logic. And Purushottama Deva is a later grammarian, certainly Buddhist, and I think a very interesting thinker. Indeed, according to some Buddhist traditions, Panini himself was Buddhist. There are many different claims about Panini, but according to some Buddhist traditions, Panini himself was a Buddhist. In fact, he obtained the awakening of a Shravaka. This idea is expressed in the form of a prophecy in the Manjushri Mulakalpa. So you can check that. Okay, now here we have some more explicit statement that karakas are causes. This is from Vekashika, this important grammatical work by Vamanan Jayaditya. Here we can see that karaka is a synonym of nimitta and hetu. So you can see these words are words for causes. And this is a verse which I personally like a lot. This is from Purushottama Deva's Karaka Chakra, from the very first verse. And he says, nimittam karakam proktam tacca karyam apekshate karya karana sambandha vicharaha suptingantayoho. Now I'd like to say something about this verse because it implies a lot. Well, a karaka is a nimitta in the sense of a cause. It's explained as a cause, and that expects an effect. The relationship, or according to the relationship of a cause and effect, or effect and cause, there is an analysis of nominal and variable endings. So in other words, we study the perfect functioning of a Sanskrit sentence in terms of causal relations. I think this is a fairly explicit statement of compatibility of interest between Sanskrit sentence analysis and the Buddhist emphasis on the analysis of causality. Purushottama Deva happens to be a Buddhist author, and in this work he does offer some views about the meaning of words which I think wish to stress the extent to which Sanskrit grammatical analysis is, at the very least, compatible and conducive to Buddhist philosophical discourse. So here's a subtitle, Flexible Words of the Grammarian. The not really autonomous agent and the status of word reference. So these are two things which are taken up by Purushottama Deva as important things in his discussion of karakas, and which I think are important to understand how and why Sanskrit grammar figures prominently in Buddhist philosophy, at least in a certain type of Buddhist philosophy. The first point is the agent is not really autonomous. And the second point is what words express is not a simple matter. To say it very briefly. So we cannot assume that when we speak a word, that word necessarily corresponds to something. This theme is something which we find also in Chandrakirti, expressed differently. So he stresses, he has this image of the Dandapashika, guards with clubs and nooses that take away the autonomy of the speaker. And Chandrakirti says that words do not work like that. Words depend on what we wish to express. In other words, there is perhaps an element of indirection between what we wish to say and the words that we use for that. He also agrees with Jinendra Buddhi that a karaka is not a thing. A karaka is a capacity. So in a certain sense, a karaka, just like a cause and effect, is a role. The same thing can be the cause for something and the effect of something. So this is another important feature of the karaka analysis, which I think in this respect too resembles Buddhist Abhidharma. Now here we have, I wanted to contrast these two passages. This is how Panini defines the agent. Swatantraha karta. The agent is the autonomous one. And then we have a passage from Velokatita Stava, karta swatantraha karmapi tvayoktam vyavaharata. Now, unfortunately, it's very difficult here to reproduce an important ambiguity in the Sanskrit, which is we can read the first two words in two different ways. We can split it as karta swatantraha or karta aswatantraha. This is Nagarjuna's refutation. Well, if we accept that the Lokatita is by Nagarjuna, but of the samskara skandha. So the fourth skandha, the fourth aggregate, is refuted by an analysis of the agent and the object of the action. So he says that conventionally you spoke of karta swatantraha, so the autonomous agent, or maybe the non-autonomous agent, depending on how we split this word, and also of an object of the action. These two splittings are attested. This is not just my own point. The Tibetan translation splits it as if it were karta swatantraha. But there is an anonymous commentary on the Lokatita Stava, which unfortunately is not yet published, but this commentary splits as karta aswatantraha, the non-autonomous agent. So I want to point out that this has an obvious echo of Panini. I think that any reader of that text would have perceived that. So, this word swatantra can have several different meanings. These meanings are discussed even in the Tibetan tradition. But the meaning of swatantra is restricted by grammatical commentators to mean the most important one. Some grammatical commentators specify that there is never a completely autonomous agent. So, when we speak of autonomous, we mean pradhana. So that is one of the important points. And the other important point is that anything that the speaker wishes to express as the most important factor in a causal process can be called or can be expressed as the agent. I think this is another very important point to understand why Buddhist philosophers, even in the context of Abhidharmic analysis, can discuss who is the agent. In other words, we can be at a level of analysis which is completely impersonal, and where all the elements at play are contingent, momentary dharmas, and yet we can still speak of an agent. This is counterintuitive if we are used to think of an agent in terms of a person, but agent here is a translation of this term, kartra, which in this context simply means whatever we wish to express as the most prominent causal factor. We could also express something which doesn't make sense, and that would be perfectly fine. Like I could say that the square circle switched on the light, and that from the perspective of syntactical analysis would be fine. The square circle is the agent of that sentence. So in that respect, we can, in fact, discuss agency even when we are discussing in terms of momentary, contingent dharmas, ultimate dharmas. Why? Because what we are really discussing is causal prominence. And here it is. Yes, this is what I was just saying. That because of a specific concern of grammar, which is making sense of how sentences work, grammar must show how, even when we want to say that something insentient is the agent, something momentary or something unreal is the agent, we can express that. It is not the concern of grammar to check whether what we express is cogent or not. And that brings us to a related issue, which is what is it that words refer to? What do they mean? This is discussed in a grammatical context under the heading of the Pratipadika Artha, which I have translated as the meaning of what is unique to that word. It's a somewhat free translation because the Pratipadika is a technical term, but it does refer to the part of a Sanskrit word which is really unique to that word. And now I will explain why. Let us take the word Buddha. What is the Pratipadika? Well, Buddha itself is the Pratipadika. Why is it unique? It is unique because if we take its two constituent elements, Bud and Kta, taken on their own, neither of them is unique. We can use the root Bud to form a variety of other words. We can use the suffix Ta to form a variety of other words. But when we put them together, we have something unique. And the referent of that word is what is being discussed when one discusses the Pratipadika Artha. So, here, this is really schematic, I'm sorry, it's somewhat simplistic. When I utter a word, does it necessarily mean that there is something existing beyond that word that this word refers to? Here are some possible solutions. According to Nyaya philosophers, yes. And Nyaya grammarians, later I'll say what I mean by that, yes. Advaita Vedanta philosophers, yes. Although in these cases too there is a certain amount of indirection. Buddhist grammarians, no. Buddhist philosophers, no. So here is the definition of the Pratipadika. Artavat adatuhu apratyayaha pratipadikam. Something which has a referent or a meaning, artavat, which is not a root, adhatuhu, it's not a particle, apratyayaha, is called pratipadika. And what do we mean by artha, by what I translated here as referent? Abhideya vachanaha artha shabdaha. Artha here means the object of expression, the object of our expression. Here, one important point made by Jinendra Buddhi. Even non-existence can be expressed. So, in other words, when we speak, it doesn't always entail the existence of the referent. So, this is from Vinyasa. And here is, this is a subsection, Purushottama Deva. How Purushottama Deva elaborates on this idea. Purushottama Deva has to make sense of two things. What we have just seen earlier, which is Jinendra Buddhi says that even non-existence can be expressed, or even a non-entity, a non-existent entity can be expressed by a word. Yet we have this statement of Patanjali that na padartaha sattam vyabhicharati. The meaning, the referent of words does not stray from existence. In other words, the meaning of the words always refers to some level of existence. Purushottama Deva found a very ingenious solution to make these two ideas compatible. But I have to introduce some more ideas before getting to that. So, in his work, the Karaka Chakra, Purushottama Deva starts by analyzing a Vedanta position about word reference, according to which all words, perhaps not directly, but ultimately do refer to real existence. And Purushottama Deva offers these three objections, that if these were the case, then terms like non-existence, a hare's horn, should not be there. We should not have expression like the pot has vanished, and we should not have expressions which refer to the coming into existence of something. And the reason he gives is interesting, because there is no birth for something that already exists. Sataha janma abhava. Now, this immediately sets Purushottama Deva aside from the Vaibhashika position, because for the Vaibhashika, in fact, we do have the birth of something which already exists, since dharmas already exist in the three times. So from this we already know something about Purushottama Deva's philosophical lineage. But here is his solution. He divides existence into two types of existence. One which we know, Vastu Satta, we know this type of Satta because we find it very often mentioned in Buddhist texts. Vastu Sat is a synonym for Dravya Sat or Paramartha Sat in many Buddhist texts, which means ultimate existence. An existence which is there whether we have a concept of it or not. In other words, it doesn't depend from our conceptualization. Something which is not there just due to our own ideas about things, but it is there on its own accord. So this is one type of existence. And according to Purushottama Deva, that is not the type of existence entailed by words. What words entail is what he calls Abhideya Satta, existence as a possible object of expression. And he says that is all we need. Now this, for me, is quite interesting because it's partly similar, but not entirely, to the difference between Prajñapti Sat and Dravya Sat. It's not exactly the same thing. Abhideya Satta is a much broader category. It's a much, much broader category. But nevertheless, this kind of subdivision being proposed by a Buddhist author, I think, could have partly that background. And here are the examples that he gives, which match the three objections that we had found earlier. A non-entity or non-existence, abhava, something past, bhuta, future, bhavishya, or something utterly non-existent. Again, the fact that he gives bhuta and bhavishya, something past and something future, as examples here, shows that he's not really a Vaibhashika, because for a Vaibhashika those would exist. And here his explicit reference to Patanjali. He says that if we accepted that the type of existence that is implied by using words is real existence, Vastu Satta, then we wouldn't be able to make sense of what Patanjali had said earlier. You remember Patanjali said that padartha, the meaning of words, does not stray from existence. Nasattam vyabhicharati. So he says that would not make sense. Okay, going back to the word Buddha, I want to explain a little bit how I would understand, in brief, the grammar of the word Buddha. And now, it sounds strange to speak of a grammar of a single word, but such is the nature of Sanskrit language in my understanding. And this is an important feature of Sanskrit, which I think if any of you is interested in studying Sanskrit, already studying Sanskrit, maybe you're all Sanskrit scholars, actually, I don't know. So forgive me if I'm saying something that you already know, but I think this is a very important part of learning how to think through a Sanskrit text, which is there is something about the relationship between the action and the factors that bring about that action, which is expressed within a word itself. And the two elements that allow us to do that in Sanskrit are the root and the pratyayas. Actually, there's more than one pratyaya. But here we have the example of the word Buddha is formed by Bud, which is a root with several meanings, like also awakening or understanding. And then we have this pratyaya kta, which has the sense of a participle, and here usually is understood as referring to an agent. So once we have just the word Buddha without correlating it to any other element in the sentence, that itself tells us that we are talking about possibly the agent of this action of awakening or understanding. Furthermore, we can coordinate this Buddha with some other action in the sentence through some other layer of suffixes, the vibhaktis namely, which tell us how the word Buddha will relate to, for example, the action expressed by deshayati. So Buddha deshayati tells us that Buddha is not only the agent of the action of Buddha, but is also the agent of the causative action of dish. So the Buddha is not only the one who has awakened, but is also the one who teaches. And thus here it's translated as the Buddha teaches. Okay, now this is a small summary of what I said so far. A sentence resembles the process of dependent arising. So this is a point. I hope this point is somewhat becoming comprehensible, that there is some similarity in the way we can understand Sanskrit sentences and in the way we understand the process of dependent arising. Second important point, the reference involved may be anything whatsoever. It can be something existent, non-existent, absurd. It can be something momentary. It can be something sentient. It can be something insentient. Some points about Abhidharma. In Abhidharma, we have this distinction, in some types of Abhidharma at least, between Dravyasat and Prajñaptisat. Dravyasat means real reference. It means things which exist of their own accord. And Prajñaptisat are conceptual groupings. So in other words, when we have a number of real existing entities and we group them through one concept, that type of existence is called Prajñaptisat. For example, a table could be understood as Prajñaptisat Dharma in the sense that it is a name for a collection of dharmas which, on the other hand, really exist, whether I have the idea of this name or not. In Madhyamaka, on the other hand, when we talk of dependent arising, all the references are dependent upon concepts. So there is no referent which exists over and beyond our concepts. And the last point, I think, is interesting to me, at least for its relationship with grammar, which is, in all Buddhist accounts of ignorance, maybe I should not say that. I should say, in the few Buddhist accounts of ignorance or misapprehension that I know of, a common problem is a misunderstanding about the level of reality of the reference. So when we speak, we impute a sort of excess of reality to what is implied by the words we use. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm taking more time than maybe I'm allowed to. I think I can make it. Now, Abhidharma. We have encountered this idea of kriya, an activity or an action, which is what is brought about by the karakas in the context of grammar. Well, this idea of kriya is also very important in the context of Abhidharma. In particular, it is employed to make sense of the process of pratitya samutpada, of dependent arising. This is particularly true in case of the Vaibhashika tradition. Now, the Vaibhashika tradition has this doctrine that dharmas exist in the three times. And one way to make sense of that is to distinguish between the existence and the actual activity of the dharmas. In other words, past dharmas exist, future dharmas exist, present dharmas exist. The difference between these three is indeed their activities. The future dharmas have not yet gone through their activity. The present dharmas are in the process of completing their activities, and past dharmas are dharmas which have completed their activity. So in terms of explaining the basic way in which dharmas go through the process of dependent arising, the idea of activity seems to be important for the Vaibhashika. For the Sautrantika, the idea of Kriya is important for a different reason, which is this is how they decide that something exists. So something that exists is something which is active. Artha Kriya is the mark of existence. In both cases, what brings about Kriya, activity, whether we identify it with existence or whether we distinguish it from existence, is an assemblage of causes and conditions. In fact, this is also highlighted in the analysis of the term pratitya samutpada, which I've translated here as dependent arising, but we should be aware, I think, that translating pratitya samutpada as dependent arising goes through a specific choice in the interpretation of the word pratitya. Not all commentators would agree that that is the best choice, but it is perhaps the most common, as far as I know, which is taking pratitya as an absolutive rather than as a noun. The other alternative is to take pratitya as meaning things which disperse, and in that case it would be the arising of things which disperse. But this is the most common one. Now, we do have a very interesting problem when we look at the word pratitya samutpada. The problem is that there is an apparent paradox, which is, here we have two activities. One activity which is expressed by the word pratitya, and one activity which is expressed by the word samutpada. So far, no problem. But according to the grammatical rules that govern the usage of the Lyabanta forms, of which pratitya is one example, the activity of pratitya should occur before the activity of samutpada. So the activity of being dependent on something should occur before something arises. And it should be the same agent. So Buddhist philosophers discuss different possible solutions to this, and indeed grammarians too show that there are cases where this rule can be taken not so strictly. However, it was perceived to be a problem. You can find a discussion of this point in the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya, where different possible solutions are mentioned. But what I wanted to highlight is that the importance of kriya, of activity, in the case of pratitya samutpada, becomes evident even when we see the grammatical explanation of the very word pratitya samutpada in certain Buddhist texts, and there we see the overlap between the two types of concerns, which is grammatical analysis and the analysis of causal processes. Here are two types of descriptions of dependent arising which I think are recurrent in Buddhist texts and important for Madhyamaka too. One is a continuum of many instants through time. So this is well expressed by the 12 limbs of dependent arising. And the other one is a specific instant in time. So chakshu praditya rupani cha utpadyate chakshur vijnanam. An instant of eye consciousness arises in dependence upon the eye and visible forms. And here is a sentence from the Abhidharma Kosha Karika which captures the second type of process. Chakshuhu pashyati rupani. The eye sees form. If you remember the sentence that we discussed earlier, you might already anticipate that in this sentence, Chakshuhu is the agent. So, and this is what is being discussed in the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. Can really the eye be the agent? I think that these two sentences are related. I think that Chakshuh Pashyati Rupani is somehow a paraphrasis of this. So here it is, agent, activity, object of the action. And three different views mentioned by Vasubandhu. The eye is the agent of seeing. That is one view. Another view is that consciousness is the agent of seeing. And the other view is that actually we should not insist on this type of analysis at the level of Abhidharma. But the reason is that, strictly speaking, the Dharmas are nirvyaparam. They do not have activity. That's an interesting Sautrantika view. This is another text which is an opponent of the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. And this text gives us an interesting explanation of why the eye is the agent of seeing. It's because it's the most prominent causal factor. And so we go back to the grammatical explanation. Whatever we wish to explain as the most prominent causal factor, we call the agent. And the eye is the one which determines the quality of the eye cognition. So, in other words, there's many causal factors which bring about an eye cognition, but what determines whether the eye cognition is of higher or lower quality is the quality of the eye. And because of that reason, we can consider it the most prominent. It doesn't just cause it to come about, but it also determines its quality. The point that we should take the agent, as the most prominent is also made by Vasubandhu when he discusses who is really the agent in the Pudgala Vinishchaya, which is meant to refute the idea of an ultimate self. And here he encounters some opponents who argue that the self is the agent. And actually, while refuting that, he insists that whatever we consider to be the main causal factor is the agent. So when we take what Panini said, we should not take it to mean literally autonomous, but just most prominent. So here, Vasubandhu brings in a specification which we find in grammatical commentaries to make sense of the usage of the word agent even within a context of impersonal dharmas. And Yashomitra has a nice comment here. He says, if we accept that it is the most prominent, then we can establish the process of dependent arising. So I think this is, I like this comment very much because it suggests that Yashomitra is saying it is this commentarial specification which we find in the grammatical commentaries which allows us to speak of an agent even in the context of dependent arising. Okay, this is somewhat a summary of what I just said, so I'll skip it because I'm already very late. So now we go back to Nagarjuna's verse. Kriyana pratyavati, na pratyavati kriya, pratyana kriyavantascha santyuta. Okay? There is no activity endowed with conditions. There is no activity not endowed with conditions. There are no conditions not endowed with an activity or endowed with an activity. I hope that now the verse starts looking different after we have gone through all these, that you can see that perhaps there are some echoes of both Abhidharma and grammar and of their overlap. So, what's the link between conditions and activities? In a Vaibhashika context specifically, conditions cause not the existence but the activity of the dharmas. So if we want to include a refutation that bears upon the Vaibhashika view, it's important to specify this kriya. And more generally, different dharmas have activity or efficacy in respect to specific domains. The eye has the activity of seeing, the ear has the activity of hearing, and so forth. So even beyond the specifically Vaibhashika framework, we can see the relevance of activity. Okay, the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya also mentions the conditions and then explains them all in terms of their charitra, also distributing it between the future and the present. Meaning, some conditions have efficacy or activity in respect to the future and some in respect to the present. Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti both conclude their commentaries by stating that it is not possible to have activity in any of the three times, thus suggesting an emphasis on the refutation of the Vaibhashika. Yeah, this is a quotation from the Prasannapada, and this is a comparative table of the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya and the Prasannapada, where I think we can see some similar concerns. 4 commentaries here. There's one more that I'll briefly mention later. Buddhapalita, again, he mentions the action of cooking. So this very mention, that's one reason why I brought about Devadatta Odanam Pachati. Devadatta cooks rice. It's a recurrent grammatical example. If we don't know that, we don't know why we find this in Buddhapalita. So why do the commentators to Nagarjuna all end up speaking about cooking? Well, the reason is they want to highlight an explicit link to Sanskrit grammar. And this is, briefly, how Buddhapalita's commentary works. His commentary is not too long on this section. Gunamati does not survive on its own, but he's quoted by Bhaviveka. And Gunamati is a Yogacara commentator of Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna has been commented upon even by Yogacara philosophers who take him to be a Yogacara philosopher. Bhaviveka offers us a nice autonomous reasoning where actually he uses the example of Devadatta and explicitly, again, calls Devadatta and the rice, etc., as pratyayas, conditions. So Bhaviveka is quite explicit in making this match. And also he has a complete list for the conditions of the rising of consciousness. So he's also more thorough when dealing with the Abhidharmic side. Chandrakirti, I think overall is close to Buddhapalita. And again, he has some link to grammar, but no specific mention of cooking the rice. Then there is one more commentator, which I should mention, and this is, I have to thank Professor Ye Xiaoyong, which helps my argument. Well, there's the sub-commentator to Bhaviveka, which is Avalokitavrata. Avalokitavrata explicitly says that this verse is addressing those Vaibhashikas and Sautrantikas who wish to establish their position by means of grammar. So actually it was within the commentarial tradition that this idea was perceived very clearly. It's quite ancient. It's not just my own idea. Okay, these are some important features of this chapter. The term kriya and its grammatical sense are relevant for the Madhyamaka explanation of causality, and there is a direct and well-established parallel between conditions and syntactical factors. If this parallel had not been well established by the time of the commentators, they could not have referred to grammar so elliptically. Okay, let me see. Oh, okay, this is the last one. So, Nagarjuna's verse discusses Kriya in such a way as to bear upon both dependent arising and syntax. And I think this is important for a specific feature of Madhyamaka thought, which is the relationship between notional dependence and existential dependence. When we are in a system where these two are much closer than in other systems, then of course syntactical analysis could have a greater role to play. I think this is one reason why we find karaka discussions in unexpected places or counterintuitive places in Madhyamaka commentaries. This context is clarified by the commentaries. Buddhist authors consider Panini's syntax flexible. This I think is an interesting point. When Buddhist grammarians argue against non-Buddhist grammarians, their argument, in my opinion, is quite nuanced, because they're not just saying Panini's grammar fits our position better. What they're saying is slightly different. They're saying Panini's grammar, and generally the way Sanskrit grammar works, doesn't entail a one-to-one match with a specific philosophical position, as you would want it to work. So they're not saying it matches Buddhist philosophy perfectly. They're saying it's flexible, and therefore we can also use it. And this is another point which I think is important. This gap between the way words work and the way reality works, which is highlighted by grammarians, is also similar to the concern of Buddhist philosophers about the distance between the intent of the speaker, and often the intent of the Buddha, and the actual words that the Buddha employs. So sometimes the Buddha might employ very direct explanations, and sometimes the reference to the reality of things might be rather indirect. So I think there also there is a certain similarity of concerns. I'm sorry I took up much more of your time than I should have, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, questions and comments, please. Stephen.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. I found very interesting in many respects. I have a question on this notion of Abhidharma Sattva that you mentioned at some point. I was just curious. In a sense, is there a criterion? Is it discussed a criterion for excluding anything from this category? Actually, probably it's impossible. Or is it discussed whether it can be defined in any way, or if just, probably is all, insofar as we can mention something, therefore that is true at that level without any further requirement, right?
I think so. I think that it would just require it to be a pratipadika.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah.
So as long as it is a comprehensibly well-formed word,
Exactly.
perhaps not even perfect, but that would be sufficient to obtain Abhidharma Sattva.
Because any reference to, let's say, reality is completely out of question.
Exactly. That is at least how I understand Purushottama Deva's argument. It's not too easy to understand it simply because it's fairly brief. Perhaps it's one page. But I understood it in that way, that there is no limit to what one could express, meaning it doesn't have to have any level of reality whatsoever.
So just on the point, so would they then say that the reference of the term the inexpressible is Abhidharma Sattva?
Yes.
Well, that lands them straight into a contradiction, because then the referent of something inexpressible is expressible.
But I think that there is a difference between. I'm not sure that Abhideya and Abhilapya there would be considered perfect synonyms. So what you would refer to as inexpressible would probably be Nirabhilapya. I'm not sure exactly whether it would be a perfect synonym of Nirabhideya or something like that. I think there is a slight difference.
Because that would be the only example where I could say that something is not Abhidharma Sattva.
Yes, the problem is that I've used the word expression and I would also use it to translate both. But I think Abhidharma and Abhideya are slightly more technical terms. And Nirabhilapya goes a little bit more towards something which cannot be the object of conceptualization. And that doesn't seem to be the concern here at all. So in that respect, I think perhaps the problem wouldn't arise. It just arises because there is an overlap of terminology in the translation that I chose.
I'm sort of rather profoundly puzzled in one sense. Please criticize what I'm going to say, but my understanding has always been that the Buddha was fundamentally opposed to Sanskrit because of the theory that went with it. That Sanskrit was ultimate reality on which the world was based. Sanskrit was created, as it were, first, and reality was there to mirror Sanskrit. So it's not a sort of chance that go means cow. A cow is created, has come into being to be go. The Sanskrit language is the blueprint for reality. Therefore, as is well known, the Buddha was very hostile to the use of Sanskrit. He said that people shouldn't use Sanskrit for talking about the teachings. And after all, language never reflects. The Brahmins are fundamentally wrong, because language never represents reality. For one thing, reality is changing all the time, and the words of the language as we use them don't, as it were, change. They're a code which we learn which is fixed, and a fixed code is never going to get to the ultimate truth of what that code is supposed to refer to. I'm not particularly surprised that later, many centuries later, Indian philosophers should have tried to have their cake and eat it, so to speak, and say that, well, your Sanskrit grammarians lay down these rules and we can show that we can accommodate to that too. But, I mean, the whole issue of reality and unreality, surely for the Buddha isn't there at all, because language simply cannot reach reality. It doesn't mean that that there is no reality, but language cannot reach it by its very nature, as put forward in those arguments. And that is why, of course, the Buddha encouraged the use of any language whatever. Language is purely pragmatic. It's a pragmatic instrument. Is that all wrong?
No, I think that's...
I don't mean whether the Buddha was wrong, but am I wrong in my interpretation of the Buddha?
Well, your question is complex. It's very complex for me. First of all, there's different Buddhas, in the sense that the Buddha of Vasubandhu maybe didn't have so much against Sanskrit. And the Buddha of Vasubandhu, Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti is the Buddha that I'm
going
here.
to talk about this absolutely heretical idea, the real Buddha. The Buddha who's being reported in the Pali Canon.
Well, there's a problem with what you just said, because according to what you just told me, you cannot speak of a real Buddha.
I can.
But you said language cannot reach reality.
But you can be closer than, to say this is a pen, ultimately pens change, etc., languages, but you can be further. To say it's a carrot would be much worse.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
It's an approximation.
Okay. Sure. I meant to say that my concern in this paper was not as ambitious. In fact, I didn't take up really the possibility of reconstructing the intent of a real Buddha within this talk. But I would still like to try to answer your question. Well, there's also many types of approaches to Sanskrit. And the way in which many Sanskrit grammarians approach, let's say, Panini, is indeed to show that there is no necessary direct link between language and reality, and indeed Sanskrit is so flexible in its manner of expressing reality or unreality that we can employ it even when we know very well that we are not going to reach reality through language.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, those philosophers who think that even the transmission of the Buddha's teachings available in Sanskrit is authentic, like let's say Vasubandhu, Nagarjuna or Chandrakirti, I believe consider that Sanskrit doesn't have the problem that you highlighted. In other words, they do not necessarily associate the usage of Sanskrit with the type of Brahminical ideology that you refer to. Moreover, Panini himself distinguishes between two types of Sanskrit, which is the Chandasa and the Laukika. And I think, and this in this respect, you're the one who can correct me, but the passages where we find the Buddha discouraging from recording his teaching in Sanskrit do not exactly say Sanskrit, but they say that it's the Chandas that should not be used.
Yes.
And that does not necessarily exclude the Laukika usage of Sanskrit. Indeed, we have entire Buddhist grammars of Sanskrit which exclude the Chandas. A very good example of that is the other great work by Purushottama Deva, the Bhasha Vritti. Bhasha is a synonym of Laukika type of language, and they just excluded everything which had to do with the Veda. And I think that this was perceived to be perfectly okay by the Buddhist community employing Sanskrit. Also, I think that there was a tradition in the Pali tradition as well of using Vyakarana, including Sanskrit grammar, to make sense of the Buddha Vachana. Indeed, there are Pali grammars where it is said that somebody who studies the Tipitaka, without having studied Nirutti, Yo Nirutti Nasiketa, is going to get stuck at each and every word. There is a pun, pade pade. Just like a blind elephant in the forest. Vane andagajoyata. And there is a pun, because the word pada can mean a step, but it can also mean a word.
Yeah.
So, and that kind of idea actually occurs, I found, not so rarely in the Pali commentarial literature. Of course, it's late, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that necessarily the usage of Sanskrit or Sanskrit Vyakarana has to be understood in the context of a Brahminical ideology. And I think a counter-argument to that is also how Sanskrit grammarians explain the importance of studying Vyakarana, how the importance of studying Vyakarana is discussed in the context of the Panchavidyasthana, in the Mahayana context, where it doesn't have to do anything with a perfect match of language and reality. It's a completely different reason. Is indeed to benefit others through eloquence and through precision in speech. And also, within the Pali tradition, we find that the necessity of studying Sanskrit was discussed, for example, by Burmese monks, who were discussing why did the Buddha, while he was a bodhisattva, study also Sanskrit? And they gave some reasons. They say because we should also study what is lokiya. And this, I think, is also an idea which comes in handy when understanding the Buddhist approach to Sanskrit grammar. There are a series of shastras which sometimes are called Laukika, or there's also another term, Sarvesham Upayogi, that is helpful for everyone. So it's not directly linked to liberation, perhaps, but it's something that can help interacting with a broader intellectual community. So in that respect also, I think that for the Buddhist intellectual community that was employing Sanskrit, this did not entail the type of commitment to the Brahminical ideology that you have referred to, nor do I think that they perceived what they were doing as problematic at all, because by their time the idea that the Buddha Vachana had been transmitted in Sanskrit too had been fairly well established. Now, does that really go against what the Buddha said?
Well, yes, I mean, that's very interesting what you say and very valuable. I would say to all that, centuries have gone by. I mean, this is a historical question.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a historical question. I mean, of course, Buddhism exists in India. The people who lead and run intellectual life are the Brahmins. If you decide that you've got to, they are arguing with you, you've got to reply to argument, you've got to talk to them. Of course, you have to use Sanskrit. The Jainas have to do the same, and so on. But this is all a long way from the original position, because I mean it's all for getting on in the world. I mean, it isn't all for the man in the street; it's for the pundits who are arguing with each other. I mean, Lakia we have to take with a kind of pinch of salt. Yes, it means it's not Vedic, but it certainly isn't also what everybody knows. So it's I mean, the examples abound. For example, the take-up of vegetarianism. The influence of Brahmanism is always pretty overwhelming, and then there are fightbacks and sort of struggles over the centuries. It's not at all surprising that in Burma, we're talking now about.
Oh, this was very recent.
Second millennium AD, where there's been so much Indian influence and so on. They think it's very important to learn Sanskrit. Well, you're talking about something much earlier, but even there, you're not talking about anything BC.
Am I talking about something?
Yes, Lance.
Obviously, the situation at present is we have no evidence that any Buddhists used Sanskrit before the 2nd century AD for anything.
Before the 2nd century AD?
We have no evidence. This isn't to say that we're sure that they didn't.
Sorry,
the earliest texts
Buddha Ghosa?
all in forms of Prakrit, including Mahayana Sutras.
What about Buddha Ghosa, the Buddha Charita?
Would you date him before the 2nd century AD? I wouldn't.
I thought that someone did, that they found...
pretty speculative.
Well, they found a manuscript.
Anyway, my point, however, that I want to ask or raise, is that there is a bit of a contrast between modern Pali studies and modern Madhyamaka studies. I think it's partly because they've been going on longer. In modern Pali studies, there's a marked tendency to be very skeptical of the commentaries as an authentic representation of what they're commenting on. Because it seems to me that there's a tendency in Madhyamaka studies very much to rely on these, after all, rather later texts. It's hard to say how much later because we don't actually know when to date Nagarjuna, and we don't actually know which text it is, to make life particularly complicated. But it's at least possible that the kind of arguments that you're citing are much more to do with the later development of the tradition. In the specific case that you've been dealing with, I would want to see the verse on pratyaya as much more related to lists of pratyaya in the old canonical Abhidharma traditions.
Well, actually...
And you don't touch that at all.
No, I do. I've written an article on that, actually.
You didn't touch it in the paper?
Yeah. But I think that, in fact, that kind of proves my point, because the list of pratyayas that Nagarjuna uses, and indeed the definitions that he seemed to be referring to, are not common to the Pali tradition, as far as I know. They're quite different. On the other hand, they seem rather close to the Sarvastivada fold, and they seem close to what would be considered a canonical text in the Sarvastivada fold, which is the Pratyaya Sutra.
Yes.
So we find that there. But that is indeed still connected to the explanation of Praditya Samutpada, and therefore here I'm bringing up an extra set of considerations which have to do with the relationship with the idea of Kriya. That Nagarjuna knew grammar is something which I think nobody really doubts.
No, of course not.
But the link to dependent origination is quite clear. And it's there in all the traditions. And we do
Yes.
have to remember that the Pali tradition and the Sarvastivadin tradition are only two of a number of
That is true.
Abhidharma
That is-
traditions about which we know little.
I completely agree. In fact, I find that identifying Nagarjuna's Abhidharmic opponents is extremely difficult, because what I have noticed is that there seems to be some overlap with Sarvastivada ideas, but it's not identical to the Sarvastivada that I know, at least. And
Sorry.
you had your hand.
Yes, mine's actually a sort of rather simple, starting quite early question, because I take Richard's point, but I wonder if the very formulation of early Abhidhamma was itself influenced by grammatical procedure, not that, or a kind of a way of analysis. The reason I say that is just something that you were almost saying something I'd always wondered vaguely about, which is that the Patana, which seems has 24 relations, and which is very Pan-Indian, and there seems something about the relationship of the way the Patana is described, which feels quite grammatical to me on a purely intuitive level. But that is not an argument either way. But just I wondered if you had thought of looking in that.
Well, I haven't thought about looking into it in respect to Pali Abhidharma, but what I can say is that
I'm talking
Nagarjuna.
about whether the actual very formulation of it was influenced by grammatical, and I just don't know. It's just a question.
I remember this, that Nagarjuna has a verse, I think in the Ratnavali, where he compares the Buddha to a grammarian. And he says that just like a grammarian would teach the matrakas. So actually he uses this term, which is an interesting overlap. And the other point is that I cannot say for Pali Abhidhamma, but certainly the Abhidharma Kosha, Bhashya, and the Karaka itself works according to some principles of grammar, which are highlighted by Vasubandhu himself. For example, the principle of anuvritti, of pulling something from a previous verse. Sometimes he says, this is anuvartaniyam, means to be pulled from a previous karika. And sometimes he says, yatha sankyam, that again, yatha sankyam anudesha samanam. And in other cases, there is upasankyana. He says, this is upasankyana. And then Yashomitra says, somebody said, why did he make an upasankyana, an exception? He says, Yashomitra says, this is a mark of a great Shastra. Why? Because the Lakshanikas, which is a term used for the grammarians, actually always do upasankyana. In fact, the very term Lakshanika or Lakshana used for grammar is a very interesting overlap. One of my arguments is that Lakshanas are crucial in reading Buddhist philosophy, and that also has a link to grammar. In terms also of style, content, philosophical argumentation, I find that grammar has a great impact, at least in the type of Buddhism that I'm dealing here. Vasubandhu and Nagarjuna's commentator, and I would say Nagarjuna himself.
Well, Stefan had a question, and then you had a question. Stefan.
Okay, yes, I hope quickly. Could you go back to there was a frame when you presented the two models of Pratitya Samutpada? So
Oh yes.
Just quickly, there was one thing that I wanted to remark.
I'm sorry, I haven't numbered the...
Here, it's related to the... here it's perfect, okay, you just stop here.
Oh, sorry, but no.
No, but that would have been better. Now, where you were now,
okay.
It was even better, because I
this
wanted
one?
to make... Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So, exactly. So here, it seems to me that you pointed out in some commentaries, they were trying to see which is the cut or the agent.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that might not be an example, perhaps of a distorting influence of grammatical analysis, because it seems to, if you look for the agent here, in a sense you're introducing a dimension of the hierarchy or subordination in a model which to me is rather paratactical, in a sense. It's, basically we can't say who does what, but we simply notice that, in coordination with this and that, something upadyate, which is not really so agential in a sense. Upadyate just comes up by itself. So I wonder, because that, looking for an agent here would not be my reading, and I don't think even grammatically, in a sense. It's Chakshur Vijnanam comes up depending on this and that.
Yeah, that that depends on which model of Pratitya Samutpada one is operating within. According to some models, there is indeed one cause that happens to be more prominent than others. So I think it is within those models that one looks for an agent.
But exactly, my point was that there are these models, perhaps just because one was looking for, they might have been influenced. And I have no normative. I'm perfectly happy with different interpretations, but just as historical phenomenon, that would be an example of influence of grammatical...
That could be, but I'm not certain, because something related to that is discussed by Yashomitra when he offers some alternatives about whether there's any distinction between the concept of hetu and the concept of pratyaya, and he says some people say there is no difference, some people say that there is a difference. I think, though, personally, I usually refrain from making very strong historical conclusions, because normally I feel that I lack the evidence. So in this case, I think that what you said is possible, but I think that to find something which would corroborate it strongly, it's not so easy.
Just got time, I'm afraid, for one more question.
Okay, I had a very precise point, which is about your Svatantra argument.
Yes.
But actually, perhaps it's a little time, so just to make a more general point. The criticism so far seemed to be very much about the historical mesh between what you presented on both sides, on the grammar tradition and the Buddhist tradition. I'm personally not sure that we need to worry about whether harmony is overloaded with Brahminical theory. It seems that you can use harmony if you're a modern linguist fairly effectively. There's something there to take away. But the second point really is that, so I'm assuming your reading of Svatantra is that there's no need to produce the privative, right? You can basically, you don't need to divide the compound in a way that you offer two options. And it's not essential, given what Harmony really thinks about it, the autonomous agent is not actually an independent agent. You can go with traditional reading, the first one, I think. That seems to be the way you go. But my more general criticism is, I just wonder what you thought about this, whether the problem isn't whether historical sets of data actually combine, as to whether there's just actually a kind of obvious inferential aspect to this, which is that harmony is a multi-layered system dealing with multi-agency. So in a multi-agent system, where you'd expect him to represent the different elements of agency, and then you go to Buddhism, so you have a very complex system there, which is trying to describe agency. Wouldn't it be completely natural that two systems would have a lot in common, just as a matter of sort of logical procedure, I suppose?
Yes, I thought that that's similar to what I said so far.
Yeah, it's okay. I just wonder if it's a bit true but trivial, essentially.
No, I think that in a way it is trivial, but in a way it hasn't been noticed so much. And indeed, I've even read articles where it was felt that Buddhism is somewhat incompatible with the category of agent. So it was my purpose to highlight the extent to which such is not the case, and the extent to which we can read Sanskrit grammar in such a way that indeed it works very well within a Buddhist framework. There's another example of a scholar who did that, Giraud. He wrote an article called Kim Karmeti, What is Karma? And there he shows that indeed, if we look at the Grammarians tradition, we find that perhaps the idea of karma in Panini's tradition is most compatible, if at all, with Buddhist philosophy rather than other types of Indian philosophy. So some people have noticed that there is a certain level of compatibility, and on the other hand, this idea is not so well known, and that means in practical terms that parts of the arguments, especially the arguments as they are presented in the commentaries, just remain invisible to the modern readers. I don't think that they are always represented carefully in secondary literature. So one of my, perhaps I'm making a trivial point, but this point has been overlooked enough that I think a number of texts have not been represented in their sophistication, including, for example, the Abhidharma Kosha. I think the Pudgala Vinishchaya section could have been presented better, and this also works for Madhyamaka. Some scholars in the past were very careful about it. For example, I think Jacques May, he did notice this overlap when he wrote notes. But this has not been consistent. So my purpose is, maybe not as ambitious as it looks, is to show that we gain a better understanding of these commentaries if we pay attention to the overlap of concerns with Sanskrit grammar. Because also we have to remember, in my opinion, that most of the audience of these commentaries was very familiar with Sanskrit grammar. So sometimes these references are very elliptic, and we don't...
I suppose that's in a way my criticism is just simply that maybe Panini talks about multi-agency, because multi-agency is just a fact about the world. So
that's
it's not
possible.
like he invented it.
Yeah, oh well...
It wasn't being discussed in Western thought at that time.
Yeah,
So the very fact that it
yeah.
is being discussed in both contexts suggests some commensurability in the way people were thinking in
But
terms of...
all I'm saying is that you'd expect commensurability, because there's two systems which are both dealing with essentially the same kind of architecture of things influencing other things and combining them. And it seems like quite a basic
So
point. But it's
you're
really
suggesting
interesting.
a common context for both, which
Well,
became
the
a context for Buddhism
yeah,
and
common
grammar,
context, the
but
common context is the truth. I mean, it's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
ontologically, it just is the case that words do interesting things.
That's quite interesting, because we are going completely in a different direction from But, well, I wouldn't exclude that. I find that one interesting feature about Panini's system is that it has been, to some extent, reused in its basic framework to explain very different languages. For example, Tibetan too has been explained by traditional grammarians in such a way that the karakas are very formulated. They're not exactly the same, but it's a similar system, and therefore some of the nuances of the commentaries can be reproduced. I think the same is true for the Pali tradition too, although I noticed that for the karakas they seem to rely more on the Katantra tradition. I found that there's an almost perfect, but still it's not so terribly different. And to some extent I found that even a little bit the East Asian tradition has some level of influence from Panini's grammar. It's not so perceptible, but apparently, for example, Kuei-chi, Shenzang's student, devised a system of samasa classification, which he employed even to analyze compounds in Chinese. And they don't match Panini perfectly. In fact, we don't even know exactly what each term refers to. But still, the fact that this could be done suggests that I don't know if it means that Panini and the Buddhists both understood the reality of the world. I don't know if we can go that far, but perhaps it means that there's. My understanding is that there's an element of flexibility, and in this type of analysis, which indeed makes it easy to employ it in many different contexts. And this is a feature of Panini, which I think is I like it very much, and I think is one of the reasons why, apart from the and there's an element of flexibility also in the Buddhist understanding of praditya samutpada. So whether it's because it's flexible or whether it's because it's the reality of thing is a different issue, but it seems it is of broad applicability.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to vacate the room.
Thank you.